The auction sign at the end of the lane said 22 acres, more or less, and under that in smaller print it said sold as is, and under that somebody had written in pencil, not a blade of grass on it worth the name, which was accurate. The hill sat back off County Road 9 in the kind of bald patch a man could see from a half-mile away, red clay showing through in long scars where the rain had been cutting it for years, broom sedge clumped in the low spots, because broom sedge was about all that would still grow there, and not one green thing worth calling pasture from the fence line to the crown of it. Walt Ferris had run cattle on it 30-some years, without ever moving a fence, or resting a foot of it, and when Walt Ferris died the ground he left behind looked like a man who had been worked past what he had to give, which was the point Reuben Esch kept turning over as he stood at the back of the crowd with his hat brim low and his hands in his coat pockets, not bidding yet, just looking at the bare dirt the way he looked at most things, without making more of it than it was. Dale Hutton stood up near the front in his good coat, the kind of man who ran 400 head of beef cattle on bottomland that never wanted for green. And when the auctioneer called for an opening bid on the Ferris Hill, Dale Hutton laughed, not unkind exactly, and said to the men around him, loud enough for the whole yard to hear it, that Hill's been finished since Eisenhower. And a few men laughed with him, because it was funny in the way a true thing is funny. Reuben raised 2 fingers, $340 an acre, which was less than a tenth of what decent ground was bringing that spring, and the auctioneer took it because nobody else wanted it badly enough to argue, and the gavel came down on a bald hill nobody but an Amish farmer in a straw hat had bothered to bid on. Dale Hutton turned around in his seat and looked at Reuben over the heads of the crowd and said, "You're going to graze that." And Reuben said, "In time." And Dale Hutton said, "There's nothing left up there to graze, son. You'll starve whatever you put on it inside a month." And a few men murmured the kind of agreement that costs nothing to give. Reuben did not answer that. He signed the paper, paid the deposit, and walked back out to his buggy past men who were already composing the story they would tell at supper. And he did not hurry, and he did not explain himself, because there was nothing yet to explain, only a bare hill and a folded deed in his coat pocket, and the specific attention of a man who had noticed something on that hillside that nobody else standing in that yard had thought to look for. He noticed it walking the fence line before the bidding started, while the other men were drinking coffee out of the backs of their trucks. In the lowest draw of the property, under the broom sedge, the ground was not cracked the way the rest of it was. It held a little give underfoot, which meant it was holding a little water still, which meant the subsoil down there had not entirely quit, whatever the surface looked like. That was the anomaly. Nobody else had walked it in boots instead of judging it from a truck window, and nobody else had pressed a heel into the clay to feel what was still alive under a hill that everybody had already buried. He drove home with the deed on the seat beside him, and did not say a word the whole way. And that was the whole of it. For now. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. Reuben Esch was 38 years old that spring. A broad, quiet man with a beard going gray early at the corners the way his father's had, and he farmed 60 acres of corn, oats, and hay 2 miles east of the Ferris place, on ground his grandfather had cleared, and his father, Levi Esch, had worked until the stroke took him 3 winters back. Quick, and without much warning. The kind of death the family did not talk about beyond saying he went easy, which was mostly true and mostly beside the point. Reuben had married young, had 4 children with his wife Ruth, the oldest a girl of 11 and the youngest a boy of 3, and he had spent the years since his father's passing running the home place the way Levi had taught him to run it, which was carefully, on paper, with an eye toward the next 10 years instead of the next season. The county around them had been settled by Amish families 3 generations back, dairy and grain country mostly, hill country in the eastern end where the ridges ran steep enough that row crops gave out and pasture took over, and pasture in that part of the county had for as long as anyone could remember meant one thing, which was cattle turned out in the spring and left to graze the same ground straight through until first frost, the way English farmers like Walt Ferris and Dale Hutton had always done it, and the way most of the Amish farmers around Maple Grove Township did it too. because that was simply how Pasture was managed, and nobody had much reason to ask whether it could be managed differently until the ground itself started answering the question on its own. The Ferris Hill was the answer nobody wanted to look at directly. 30-some years of cattle left on the same acreage 12 months out of the year, cropping every blade down to the crown the moment it dared show itself, until the grass plants had no leaf left to feed their own roots, and the roots shortened up and thinned out, and finally quit altogether in patch after patch, until what had once been decent bluegrass and clover pasture was mostly clay, baked hard in July and slick as grease in a rain, feeding nothing but broom sedge and a scattering of thistle that not even the cattle would touch. It was not one dramatic ruin. It was 30 years of small, ordinary decisions, each one reasonable on its own, that added up the way debt adds up, a little at a time, until the ground owed more than it had left to give. Reuben had watched that hill go bald over the whole of his boyhood, the way you watch a neighbor's roof go gray, not thinking much about it because it was not his roof, until it was. He had not bought the hill on a whim, whatever Dale Hutton wanted to believe about it. He had been watching the price of hay climb for 3 winters running, watching his own 60 acres strain to carry the sheep flock Ruth had wanted since before their wedding, and that Reuben himself had come around to slowly, the way he came around to most changes, by turning them over in his hands for a long time before doing anything with them out loud. Sheep needed pasture more than they needed grain, and pasture was the one thing Reuben did not have enough of, and land that was priced at $340 an acre, because everyone agreed it was worthless, was, to a man doing arithmetic instead of listening to opinion, a different kind of proposition than it was to a man like Dale Hutton, who had 400 head and had never once in his life had to make land pay for itself, starting from nothing. Reuben's whole approach to that hill, before he had even worked out the particulars of how he meant to fix it, rested on one plain distinction his father had taught him years before, over a different piece of ground entirely, that being ready was different from being present, and both were better than being surprised. And Reuben did not intend to be surprised by that hill the way its last owner apparently had been for 30 years running. He went home that evening, unhitched, put the horse up, and did not say much to Ruth beyond telling her the bidding had gone the way he expected, which she took to mean it had gone exactly the way he had planned it, because that was usually what it meant when Reuben said a thing had gone the way he expected. Then he went up to the room over the wash house where his father's old ledgers were stacked, because he had a feeling, not yet a plan, only a feeling, that Levi Esch had written something once, years back, about ground gone bad from being asked too much and rested too little, and that feeling turned out to be the second thing that Hill would teach him, right behind the first thing, which was that everybody in that auction yard had been looking at the same bare dirt and seeing only what 30 years of habit had trained them to see. The ledgers were kept in a cardboard box that had once held canning jars, 11 of them altogether, cloth-bound and brown with age, each one covering a run of years from when Levi Esch had first started farming on his own account in 1962, straight through to the year before he died, and Reuben had gone through most of them once already, in the slow months right after the funeral, mostly for the numbers, what corn had yielded in a dry year, what a good milk cow had brought at the sale barn, the ordinary bookkeeping a farm needs to run honestly. He had not gone through them the second time looking for anything in particular. He went through them because the box was there, and because some nights that winter after buying the hill he could not sleep for turning the problem over. 80 acres or 22 acres of nothing much, and a plan not yet built to fix it, and a man who cannot sleep will often find his hands doing something useful in the meantime, whether his mind has caught up yet or not. It was in the 6th ledger, the one covering 1979 through 1984, that he found the page, tucked between an entry about seed corn and one about a sick heifer, written smaller than his father's usual hand, as though Levi had wanted the words kept close and not spread out where a casual reader might skim past them. It read, dated August the 3rd, 1981, in his father's careful, upright script, "Grass that is bare is not grass that is gone. It is grass that has not been let to answer yet. A field asked every day never gets to speak for itself, only to apologize for what it has left. Rest it before you judge it. And write down what you see, for someone will need this page after me. Reuben read it twice, standing up in the lamplight, and then he sat down on the edge of the bed and read it a third time, slower, the way a man reads something he suspects he is going to need to remember exactly rather than approximately. He did not know, sitting there, what ground his father had been writing about in 1981, whether it was a rented field gone hard from a bad tenant before him, or some patch of the home place itself that had needed nursing back. And it did not much matter which, because the principle sat there on the page plain enough to use on any bald hill a man happened to own. Grass that is bare is not grass that is gone. Not dead. Not finished. Only unanswered, the way a person goes quiet under too many demands and is mistaken for having nothing left to say. Rest it before you judge it, his father had written, and that line became the one Reuben carried back down to the Ferris Hill in his head the following Saturday, when he walked it a second time, alone, boots in the broom sedge, working out for himself what resting a bald hill would actually require in practice, since a principle without a method is just a sentiment, and Levi Esch had never had much patience for sentiment that did not turn into work. Over the following 2 months, Reuben did what he always did before starting anything large, which was research, quiet and unannounced, the kind nobody in Maple Grove Township saw him doing because it did not look like farming from the road. He wrote letters to 2 Amish settlements further west, where he had heard, through a cousin, that some farmers had begun grazing sheep and cattle differently, moving them through small fence sections instead of turning them loose on the whole pasture at once, letting each section rest a long stretch between grazings, the way a man rests a tired field before planting it again. He borrowed, through the bishop's nephew who worked part-time at the county library, 2 agricultural bulletins on what the English called rotational grazing, which was simply the practice of dividing pasture into smaller paddocks and moving livestock through them on a schedule, grazing each section hard and briefly, and then leaving it alone long enough for the plants to rebuild the root reserves a season of overgrazing had spent. The same principle his father had written down in his own words 2 decades before any bulletin had come along to give it a name. He wrote the arithmetic out longhand, in a new ledger he bought for the purpose, the way Levi had taught him to do with anything large enough to risk failing at. 22 acres divided into small paddocks of roughly half an acre each, a flock-size to graze 1 paddock down hard in 2 to 3 days, and then move on, and a rest period behind each paddock of no less than 45 days in the growing season, long enough for grass plants to push new leaf and rebuild the roots they had spent feeding that leaf, which was the whole mechanism in plain terms. Root reserves spent by grazing, root reserves rebuilt by rest, and pasture health rising or falling depending on which side of that ledger a farmer let win, most often. Underneath the arithmetic, in the front of the new ledger, Reuben copied his father's line out word for word: grass that is bare is not grass that is gone. And beneath it he wrote the date, and beneath that he wrote nothing else yet, because there was nothing yet to report. That was the seed of it. Not a sudden idea, a dead man's sentence, read 3 times in a cold room, and 2 months of quiet arithmetic that turned a saying into a schedule. Before a single sheep set foot on the Ferris Hill, Reuben spent the better part of that spring building the parts of the plan that nobody driving past on County Road 9 would have recognized as a plan at all, since preparation, done properly, tends to look like nothing much happening. The first order of business was water, because a pasture without reliable water in every section is a pasture a man is forced to manage around instead of on its own terms, and the hill had one spring, weak but steady, rising out of the rock at the northeast corner, where the old fence line met a stand of scrub locust. Levi's generation had solved that kind of problem with a hydraulic ram pump, a simple iron device with no motor and no electric current in it at all, that used the fall and force of the spring water itself, moving downhill through a drive pipe, to push a smaller portion of that same water uphill to wherever a man needed it, working entirely off the water's own energy and a valve that opened and shut itself with each pulse, the way a heart valve works, which was the plainest way Reuben had ever heard it explained, and the way he explained it to his own boys years later. He and a hired English neighbor boy named Tobias Marsh, 16 and glad of the day wage, spent 9 days that April digging the trench for the drive pipe, setting the ram at the bottom of the draw, and running a buried supply line up along the spine of the hill to 4 separate points, where he sank concrete tanks he'd bought second-hand from a dairy auction, so that no matter which paddock the flock was grazing, water would be close at hand without a single gallon of it needing a pump run on current. The second order of business was fencing, and here Reuben used woven wire panels, light enough for one man to carry and set by hand, hinged together in movable sections he and Tobias built over 6 weeks in the barn on rainy days. 44 sections in all, enough to divide the 22 acres into 44 paddocks of a half-acre apiece, each one small enough to graze down hard in 2 or 3 days, and then leave alone. He laid the paddock map out on paper first, walking the hill with a hand level and a notebook, running the fence lines along the natural contours of the slope rather than in straight surveyor's lines, because fence run across a hillside on the level does double work, holding livestock in one place while also slowing the path any rainwater would otherwise take straight downhill, carrying topsoil with it the way it had for 30 years under Walt Ferris's continuous grazing. That contour work he did with his own Belgian team, Duke and Bill, pulling a small furrowing plow along each planned fence line to cut a shallow swale before the panels ever went up. A trick his father had used on a washed gully 30 years before that Reuben remembered mostly as a boy walking behind the team, rather than as a lesson he'd been told outright. Which was how a great deal of what Levi Esch knew had come down to his son, not as instruction so much as memory that turned useful later. Miriam King, a widow 2 farms over, who had been taking in mending and garden work since her husband's death the year before, came on for wages that spring to help seed the bare patches with a mix of orchard grass, red clover, and bird's foot trefoil that Reuben had settled on after his letters west, broadcasting seed by hand into the fresh-cut swales and harrowing it in lightly behind the team. Because bare ground rested is still bare ground unless something is planted into it to take advantage of the rest, and Levi's line about grass not yet given the chance to answer only held true if a man actually planted something capable of answering. By the last week of April, the hill wore 44 sections of fence, 4 water tanks fed by a pump with no motor in it, and freshly seeded swales running the long way across every slope, and none of it showed from the road as anything but an odd Amish man and his hired boy stringing wire fence across a bald hill that Dale Hutton had already told half the county was past saving, which suited Reuben fine, since he had never once in his life explained a plan to anyone before it was finished proving itself. The ADUs arrived the second week of May. Katahdin and Hairsheep bought at a dispersal sale 2 counties over from a retiring shepherd who was glad to unload the whole flock at once. Hairsheep, because they shed their coats naturally each spring and needed no shearing, no barn wired for clippers, nothing an old-order farm could not manage entirely by hand, and because they were hardy on rough forage in a way that suited a hill still finding its feet. Reuben turned them into Paddock 1 on the 9th of May, a Tuesday, and wrote in the New Ledger that evening, May the 9th. 80 ewes turned onto Paddock 1. Grass height averaging 4 inches where seeded last fall, bare ground still 82% by rough count, water holding steady from the ram. He moved them to Paddock 2 on the 12th, 3 days later, exactly as the schedule called for, and continued that way through the spring, a rotation nobody in Maple Grove Township understood the shape of, because nobody had ever seen sheep move that often on purpose. Word of it reached Zimmerman's Feed and Seed inside 2 weeks, the way anything unusual in a small township always found its way to the counter, where Patty Rule rang up sacks of oats and mineral block, and heard every piece of news the county had to offer before anyone printed it. Grover Nace, a retired dairyman who came in most mornings for coffee and an opinion, was there the day Dale Hutton stopped by for fence staples, and Grover said, "You hear Esch has got 80 head of sheep up on the Ferris Hill, moving them around in little pens every couple days like he's playing checkers with them." And Dale Hutton laughed the same laugh he'd laughed at the auction and said, "He'll starve every one of them by the 4th of July. That ground can't carry 80 head of anything, And Paddy Rule, ringing up his staples, said, "That's so." And Dale Hutton said, "You wait." And Grover Nace said, "Somebody down at the sale barn's already calling it Esch's Folly." And Dale Hutton said, "Generous name for it." And they all had a small laugh over that. The kind of laugh a community has at somebody else's expense, without meaning much harm by it. The way laughter usually is in a place where everybody has to keep doing business with everybody else come Monday. The nickname stuck fastest among the English farmers who ran cattle in the township, though a few of the Amish men, Reuben's own second cousin among them, allowed at Sunday visiting that it did look like an odd use of good sheep money. Turning 80 head loose on ground even Walt Ferris's cattle had finally given up on. Reuben heard about the nickname the way he heard about most gossip concerning himself, secondhand, from Ruth, who had it from her sister, who had it from a woman who shopped at Zimmerman's on Thursdays, and he did not answer it beyond saying, when Ruth asked whether it bothered him, that a name only matters once the work is finished. Which was not quite an answer, and was also entirely his answer. What the nickname could not see, because nicknames are built from the road and not from the paddock itself, was that the sheep were doing exactly what 80 animals, grazing a half-acre hard for 3 days, and then leaving it alone for 6 weeks, were supposed to do, cropping the bare patches down to nothing in the first pass, manuring the ground evenly as they went, and then moving on before they could do the ground any second harm. The harm that comes not from grazing itself, but from grazing the same tender new growth, twice before the plant has had the chance to rebuild what the first bite cost it. That distinction between grazing and overgrazing was not about how many animals a man ran, or even how hard they grazed in a single pass, but about whether the plant was given time to recover before being asked again, a distinction Reuben explained to Tobias Marsh one afternoon. While they reset a panel, the sheep had leaned flat, trying to reach a stand of clover in the next paddock over, and Tobias, 16 and inclined to think out loud, said, "So it's not really about the sheep at all," and Reuben said, "It's about the rest. The sheep are just the tool." And that was as close as Reuben Esch came, that whole first month, to explaining his method to anyone who had not already asked him a direct question about it. The setbacks came honestly, and Reuben recorded each one the way his father had taught him to record a loss plainly, with a number attached, and no more feeling laid over it than the number itself carried. On the night of May the 23rd, a pair of coyotes came down out of the scrub locust at the north corner and took 2 lambs and injured a ewe badly enough that she had to be put down the following morning, and Reuben wrote that evening, May the 24th. Lost 3 head to coyotes overnight. Fence intact. They came over rather than through. Will need a guard. He borrowed, within the week, a livestock guardian dog from a Mennonite sheep farmer 11 miles south, a young male named Duke, coincidentally sharing a name with one of his horses, which caused Ruth some amusement at supper for several nights running, and after Duke took up residence in the flock, the losses stopped entirely, though Reuben noted in the ledger on June the 2nd that the dog had also cost him 1 morning's worth of temper, when it dragged a feed bucket, the better part of 100 yards, for reasons no one but the dog understood. On June the 9th, a June frost that nobody in the township had expected, that late caught 6 newborn lambs unprotected in paddock 11, and Reuben lost 4 of the 6 overnight, writing plainly, June the 10th. Cold snap took 4 lambs in paddock 11. Should have moved the lambing group to the sheltered draw a week sooner. My mistake, not the grounds. He did move the remaining ewes due to lamb down into the sheltered draw the following week, and lost no more that spring to weather. Twice that same month the sheep breached a panel Reuben had set on ground softer than it looked. Once wandering as far as the county road before Tobias and Duke the dog turned them back, an incident that added considerably to the story already circulating at Zimmerman's counter, since a Maple Grove Township school bus driver had seen 80 sheep milling in the road ditch and mentioned it to at least 6 households before lunch. Grover Nace relayed that one at the feed store with evident relish, saying, heard Esch's whole flock was out on Route 9 Tuesday morning. And Paddy Rule said, all 80. And Grover Nace said, far as anybody could count them before they got them turned. And Dale Hutton, present again for Salt Block, said, checkers with sheep, like I said. And this time, even one of the Amish farmers waiting his turn at the counter allowed with a small laugh that it did sound like more trouble than the ground was worth. Reuben, told of the incident by Tobias in a mortified and much abbreviated account, wrote in the ledger that night, June the 17th. Panel gave way on soft ground near the spring. Flock out on the road roughly 40 minutes before recovered. No losses, no injuries. We'll drive extra posts on that stretch. He did not mention the incident to anyone outside his own household, did not defend himself at Sunday visiting when his cousin brought it up sideways, and did not change the pace of his rotation on account of a story making the rounds at a feed store counter, because the panel failure was a fencing problem with a fencing solution, and he had learned from his father, though he could not have named the exact lesson if asked, that a man who lets gossip set his schedule for him will never finish anything on the schedule the work actually requires. By the end of June, the ledger recorded 3 coyote losses, 4 losses to a cold snap, and 1 road incident with no losses at all. 7 animals down out of the 86 the flock had grown to counting spring lambs, a number Reuben underlined once in pencil and did not comment on beyond the entry itself, because a number written down plainly is its own kind of comment. And the flock, 79 strong going into July, was, whatever the road ditch story suggested, doing exactly what he had built the panels and the water and the paddocks to let it do. The first evidence that the ground itself had begun to answer came quietly, in early July, in a place nobody was watching for it, because nobody but Reuben was watching that hill closely enough to notice small things. He had taken to walking each paddock the morning before moving the flock into it, a habit his father had also kept, walking a field before working it rather than after. And on the morning of July the 8th, in paddock 19, the section that had rested 6 full weeks since its first hard grazing in May, he found clover coming up thick between the broomsedge clumps, where 6 weeks earlier there had been nothing between them but bare red clay. He knelt down in it, the way a man kneels to look closely at something he does not want to trust his eyes about from standing height, and pressed his palm flat against the ground, the way he had a habit of doing on any soil he was judging, feeling for moisture held under the surface instead of run off the top of it, and the ground gave back a little softness it had not given in May. He did not say anything to Ruth about it that evening, beyond mentioning that paddock 19 looked promising, which for Reuben was close to jubilation, and he wrote in the ledger, July the 8th. Paddock 19, rested since May 26th. Clover germination visible between broomsedge, ground cover estimated at 19%, up from roughly 8% measured at purchase. Soil holds moisture better than expected under hand pressure. He underlined the number 19 once, the only mark of emphasis he allowed himself on the page, and that single underline was, for a man who did not talk about his feelings any more than he had to, the equivalent of another man shouting from the top of the hill. He walked out to that paddock again 2 evenings later, alone, after the children were down and Ruth was mending by lamplight, and stood in the clover a long while without doing anything at all, which was not movement exactly, and not idleness either, but something closer to a private accounting a man does with himself, when a thing he has staked considerable money and considerable pride on has just given him the first honest sign that it might actually work. He did not write about that evening in the ledger. Some entries were for the record, and some things were only for the man standing in the field, and Reuben kept a clean enough line between the two that even Ruth, reading the ledger years later, would never find any mention of the evening he stood alone in paddock 19, simply looking at clover coming up out of ground everyone else in the township had already pronounced dead. Through the rest of July the pattern held and, in most paddocks, improved, though not evenly, since paddock 6, which sat on the steepest pitch of the hill and had eroded worst under Walt Ferris's cattle, came back slower than the others and required Reuben to overseed it a second time in early August, a decision he recorded without complaint. August the 3rd, reseeded paddock 6, first planting thin, likely washed before establishing. Second attempt, heavier seed rate, straw mulch over the top to hold moisture. By the middle of August, walking the whole hill end to end on a Saturday afternoon with his oldest daughter, Leah, riding along on the wagon seat for company, Reuben counted by the rough method he had developed of pacing off each paddock and estimating green cover against bare ground in 10-foot sections, an average across the 22 acres of 46% ground cover, up from the 8% the ground had carried when the county tax assessor's own records, which Reuben had pulled that spring out of simple curiosity, had last measured it, back when Walt Ferris still owned it, and before anyone had thought to measure it carefully at all. 46% was not green from the road yet, not the kind of green a man driving past on County Road 9 at 45 miles an hour would have registered as anything but an unusually weedy pasture. But it was work made visible in a ledger. And Reuben, walking back down the hill that afternoon with Leah, asking him why the sheep kept moving pens instead of just staying in one big one, gave her the answer he would later give to a great many people who asked some version of the same question, that a field asked every day never gets to speak for itself, only to apologize for what it has left, which was his father's sentence, worn smooth now from repeating, and which Leah, 11 years old, accepted the way children accept most things their father tells them plainly, as simply true. Word of the improving ground reached the county's Soil and Water Conservation District by way of the same channel most local news traveled, which was that somebody mentioned it to somebody, who mentioned it to somebody whose job it happened to be to care. In this case, a neighbor who farmed adjoining ground, and had noticed, driving past most mornings on his way to the feed mill, that the Ferris Hill looked different than it had the summer before, greener in patches where it used to be uniformly bare, and mentioned it in passing to Diane Osterman, the district's grazing and conservation technician, who made a note of it and, being the kind of careful, unhurried professional who preferred to see things with her own eyes before forming an opinion about them, drove out to the Esch place on the last Tuesday of August to ask whether the owner of the Ferris Hill, now apparently Reuben Esch, would mind her walking it with a few instruments. Reuben said he would not mind at all, and the following Thursday morning Diane Osterman arrived in the district truck with a soil probe, a set of small metal frames she called cover point frames for measuring the percentage of ground actually covered by living plant versus bare soil within a given square, and a folder of the county's own historical data on the parcel, which as it happened included 2 aerial surveys, one from 1994 and one from 3 years back, both showing the hill uniformly bare and eroded in the same rough pattern Reuben himself had first seen from the auction yard. She walked the hill for the better part of 4 hours, setting her frames down at intervals across a dozen different paddocks, kneeling to probe the soil for compaction with a device that measured the pounds of pressure required to push a rod a set distance into the ground, a rough way of telling how tightly packed and lifeless the soil had become under years of continuous hoof traffic, and comparing what she found against the numbers in the district's own files. Reuben walked with her most of the morning, saying little beyond answering her direct questions, and when she asked, partway through, whether he kept any records of his rotation and his own observations, he went back to the house and brought out the ledger, the whole run of entries since May the 9th, and she sat on the tailgate of her truck and read through it slowly, while Reuben stood by, not offering commentary, letting the numbers do what numbers do better than a man's own account of himself. She looked up from the ledger at one point and said, "You measured this yourself, by hand." And he said, "Best I could." And she said, "Your bare ground figure for paddock 19 in May matches almost exactly what our aerial survey shows for the whole parcel 3 years ago. 8%, give or take. And your July figure of 19% for the same paddock is within 2 points of what my frame count just gave me for it this morning." And Reuben said that so, in the flat way he answered most things that pleased him more than he let show. By early afternoon, frames folded away and probe cleaned off, Diane Osterman told him, standing at the tailgate with her folder closed, that in 11 years doing that job she had seen exactly 2 properties recover this much visible ground cover in a single growing season, and both of them had cost the owner a great deal more in fencing and equipment than what she could see Reuben had put into this one, and that the compaction reading she'd taken that morning showed the soil already loosening in the paddocks, rested longest, which in her words meant water and roots were finally getting back down into ground that had been sealed shut at the surface for the better part of 3 decades. She asked whether she could bring the district's numbers back to compare formally against a follow-up visit the next summer, and whether Reuben would object to the district using his figures, with his name attached or without it as he preferred, in a case study the office sometimes prepared for other farmers wrestling with worn-out ground. Reuben said he did not object, and that his name could go on it if it helped somebody else's hill, and Diane Osterman, writing that down, said that was more cooperation than she generally got, and Reuben, walking her back to her truck, said only that the ledger wasn't his to keep quiet about, since most of what was in it had come from somebody else's writing in the first place, a remark Diane Osterman did not fully understand at the time, and that Reuben did not explain further, because some things a man keeps for the people who already know the whole of the story. The test that settled the matter for the rest of the township came the following summer, and it came the way those things generally do in farm country, not as a single dramatic afternoon, but as a long, punishing stretch of weeks that punished everyone equally, and revealed, slowly, who had prepared for it, and who had not. The rain simply stopped in the middle of June, and did not come back in any meaningful amount for 38 days, a stretch the county extension office later confirmed was the driest June and July on record, going back to 1954, and by the second week of July every pasture in Maple Grove Township that had been grazed the old way, hard and continuously, without rest, had gone the color of a paper bag, cattle standing listless in dust instead of grass, farmers hauling hay they had meant to save for winter, just to keep weight on animals that should have still been on pasture in July. Dale Hutton's own bottomland, the ground he had always been able to count on, browned out by the 3rd week of the drought to the point where he was feeding round bales to 400 head in the middle of summer, an expense he had not budgeted for, and complained about openly at Zimmerman's, where Grover Nace, no longer laughing the way he had the year before, said, "Whole county's the color of a dirt road right now," and Patty Rule said, "Whole county except that hill," and Grover Nace said, "What hill?" and Patty Rule said, "Esch's Hill. My nephew drove past it Tuesday, and said it was the only green thing on the whole stretch of Route 9. Looked like a different season up there than everywhere else." It was true, and it was visible from the road, which was the only kind of proof a story like that one ever fully needed in a township where most opinions got formed through a windshield. The paddocks Reuben had rested longest had root systems by then reaching down 18 inches and better into soil, that 2 summers of rest and a season of good rain had finally loosened enough to let roots go, looking for the moisture that dry topsoil no longer carried. And the clover and trefoil mixed through the orchard grass held green through the drought, the way deep-rooted plants generally can when shallow-rooted, overgrazed pasture cannot, since a plant cropped down to 2 inches every week its whole life never gets the chance to grow the roots it would need to reach water 38 rainless days down the line. Reuben did not change his rotation for the drought beyond slowing it slightly, giving each paddock a few extra rest days since regrowth came slower without rain, and he recorded in the ledger, on July the 22nd, 38 days, no measurable rain. Ground cover across parcel holding at approximately 68%, by my count. Best paddocks over 80. Water from the ram steady throughout. Spring itself down, but not dry. Flock condition good. No supplemental hay required yet. That last line was the one that mattered most to the men standing at Zimmerman's counter that August, because every one of them was feeding hay in July that summer. Every one but the Amish man everybody had spent a year calling the fellow with Esch's Folly, and a hill that had been the punchline of the township's driest, hardest season instead of one more casualty of it, was not a story that stayed contained to Zimmerman's counter for long. It reached Dale Hutton directly on a Thursday in early August, when he drove the 4 miles out along County Road 9 specifically, by his own later admission, to see it for himself, rather than take Grover Nace's word for it, and he pulled his truck onto the shoulder across from the hill, and sat there a while looking at 44 paddocks of green, folded across a slope he had once called finished since Eisenhower. sheep grazing calmly through clover that had not existed on that ground in living memory, while every pasture behind him for 4 miles in either direction lay the color of a paper bag. He did not go up and speak to Reuben that day. He came back the following week instead, found Reuben repairing a water line fitting near the ram pump, and stood at the fence a minute before saying anything at all, which was, for a man who had never in Reuben's memory been at a loss for an opinion, its own kind of statement. Then he said, "I was wrong about the hill. And about you, 9 words, no more," delivered flat and without a smile, and Reuben straightened up from the fitting, wiped his hand on his trousers, and said, "You were working from what you could see," which was all there was to see for 30 years, and Dale Hutton nodded once, the way a man nods when he has been let off more lightly than he expected to be, and asked, after a moment, whether Reuben would mind him bringing his own foreman around sometime to look at how the paddocks were laid out, and Reuben said he would not mind that at all. Within the month, word of Dale Hutton's visit and his 9 words had made its own way back to Zimmerman's counter, carried this time, not as a joke, but as an update. Since a community's opinion of a thing tends to travel the same road its mockery traveled, only slower and with more care taken over the wording. Grover Nace, pouring his coffee one morning that September, said to Patty Rule, "Here Hutton's putting cross fence in on his own bottomland, dividing it up small like Esh does." And Patty Rule said, "Guess Esh's folly turned out to be something else." And Grover Nace, who had coined the nickname himself the summer before without much thought to whether it would age well, said, "Guess it did." And after a pause added, "Man reads the ground different than the rest of us," which was as close as Maple Grove Township ever came to a formal retraction, delivered the same way the original mockery had been delivered, in a few flat sentences over coffee, except that the words had changed from folly to reading the ground different, a shift in language Reuben noticed the same way he noticed most things, without commenting on it to anyone but Ruth, to whom he said only that people generally come around to a thing once they've seen it for themselves, which had been his whole approach to the mockery from the first day at the auction. Diane Osterman came back that same September for her scheduled follow-up visit, and the district's second round of frame counts and compaction readings showed ground cover across the whole 22 acres at 91%, up from the 46 she had recorded the year before, and the 8 the aerial survey had shown at the start, a number Reuben recorded in his own ledger the same day, September the 14th. District measured 91% ground cover today, confirmed by their own frames, up from 46 last August and 8 at purchase. Osterman says compaction readings now comparable to ground that was never grazed hard at all. Forage yield estimated at better than 3,800 pounds dry matter per acre against roughly 900 pounds when we bought it. Rest is not the same as ruin, which was the line he had carried down from his father's ledger 16 months before and had not written into his own book until that day, because it had taken him that long, and that many numbers, to feel he had earned the right to write it down as something proven, rather than something merely hoped. Diane Osterman's district put together the case study she had asked permission for that first visit, a plain document with Reuben's own figures, reprinted alongside the district's confirming measurements, and it circulated that winter to extension offices in 4 surrounding counties as an example of what the document called, in the flattened language such documents always use, successfully rehabilitated marginal pasture through managed rotational grazing, a description that made Ruth laugh when she read it aloud at supper, since it captured almost nothing of the auction yard, the coyotes, the road ditch full of sheep, or the 9 words Dale Hutton had said standing at the fence, and captured only the numbers, which was, Reuben pointed out, probably exactly as it should be, since the numbers were the part that would still be useful to some other farmer standing at some other bald hill long after everyone had forgotten the story of how they came to exist. The economic proof, when it came, arrived by letter rather than by conversation, the way most formal business did on an Amish farm, a letter from the Ridgeline Grassland Cooperative, a regional buyers group that contracted with pasture-raised sheep operations across 3 states to supply restaurants and grocers willing to pay a premium for lamb finished entirely on grass rather than grain. A representative of theirs, having heard of the hill through the district's case study, which had made its way, as such documents do, further afield than the 4 counties it was originally intended for. The cooperative's offer, delivered by a man named Carl Ridgway, who drove out one October morning in a clean truck and walked the paddocks with obvious professional interest, was generous on its face. A standing contract for as many finished lambs as Reuben could produce off that hill each year, at a price well above what the local sale barn paid, with the cooperative covering the cost of transport to their processing facility 2 counties over. Reuben walked the offer over carefully, the way he walked over most large decisions, and told Carl Ridgway, at the end of that first visit, that he would think on it, which he did, over the following 2 weeks, working the arithmetic in the same new ledger he had used to plan the paddocks in the first place. What he decided, and told Carl Ridgway when the man came back for his answer, was that he would contract a portion of the flock's lamb crop each year, enough to be worth the cooperative's trouble and his own, but that he would not expand the flock size beyond what the 22 acres could carry on the same rest schedule that had rebuilt it, since the whole of what made that hill worth anything now was the discipline of the rotation itself, and a man who doubled his flock to chase a bigger contract would simply be overgrazing the ground again under a different name, trading the very thing the buyer was paying a premium for in order to produce more of a lesser thing faster. Carl Ridgway, who had seen a number of small operations expand too quickly once outside money showed interest, said that was, in his experience, the correct answer more often than farmers wanted to admit, and the contract they signed that November covered 55 lambs a year, a number well within what the rested pasture could support without slipping back toward what it had been under Walt Ferris, and Reuben recorded the contract in the ledger plainly, November the 2nd. Signed with Ridgeline Cooperative for 55 lambs annually, at premium grass-fed price, declined their offer to expand to full flock output. The paddocks carry what they carry, and no contract is worth asking more of this ground than it has just finished learning to give. The ripple spread through the following spring in small, ordinary ways, the way most real change spreads once the loud part of the story is finished, and only the useful part is left. Dale Hutton's cross-fencing project on his bottomland, begun that first September mostly as curiosity, became by the next summer his standard practice across the whole of his 400 acres, and he brought his foreman out to walk Reuben's paddocks twice more that year, taking notes the plain way Reuben himself took them. And at a township meeting that winter, called to discuss a cost-sharing program the Conservation District was offering for rotational fencing, Dale Hutton stood up, which surprised several people who remembered exactly what he had said in that same auction yard 2 years before, and told the room plainly that he had been running cattle in that township for 26 years and had learned more about pasture from an Amish sheep farmer in 18 months than from anything else in his career. A sentence he delivered without embarrassment and without much ceremony, the graceful admission of a man who had decided that being right going forward mattered more than having been wrong once. Miriam King, the widow who had helped seed the paddocks that first spring, took on her own small flock the following year on a rented field 2 farms over, using Reuben's fencing sections as a pattern for her own, built cheaper out of scrap wire and old gate panels, and stopped by most weeks that first season to compare notes, a habit that gave her steady work, and Reuben steady company. Neither one of them had much had since their respective losses. And on a Saturday afternoon in May, walking the hill with his father, Davy Esch, 7 years old that spring, and given to asking the kind of plain question only a child bothers to ask out loud, stopped at the fence between paddock 1 and paddock 2, and said, "Dad, why'd you put the sheep on the worst field first, instead of a good one?" And Reuben, who had by then answered some version of that question for extension agents, cooperative buyers, and a fair portion of Maple Grove Township, gave his son the same answer he had given all of them, worn down by then to its plainest possible shape, because the worst field is the one that needs the rest the most, and a thing that looks finished has usually just never been asked properly, which Davy turned over for a moment the way children do, and then let go of, satisfied, the way children generally are satisfied by an answer that sounds true, even before they've had the years to prove it true for themselves. That evening, after the chores were done and the children were down, Reuben sat at the kitchen table with both ledgers open in front of him. His father's 6th volume turned to the page dated August the 3rd, 1981, and his own turned to a blank page near the back, and he wrote beneath his father's line, in his own hand, which by then had come to look a good deal like Levi's. The Bald Hill carries 80 ewes in clover now, 2 summers of rest and 80 animals moved on a schedule, and no more than that. Rest is not the same as ruin. Reuben Esch, May. He closed both books, set them back together in the cardboard box that had once held canning jars, and carried the box up to the room over the wash house, where it had always been kept, for whichever of his own children might one day need a page out of it, the way he had needed one himself. Then he went back out in the last of the daylight, the way he did most evenings that time of year, to walk down and check on the flock in paddock 31, where Clover, the old bellwether ewe, who had wandered every paddock on that hill twice over since the day Reuben first turned the flock loose on bare ground and mockery, lifted her head at the sound of the gate and came ambling over the way she always did, expecting nothing more than what she'd been given all along, which was ground that had finally learned, with enough patience, to answer back. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told the ground they're standing on isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever taken on something everyone else had already given up on, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read,